colleagues. I am glad to introduce our first speaker on this panel, on the fifth panel, Dr. Eva Frojmovic, Associate Professor at the University of Leeds and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Leeds, the United Kingdom. Dear Eva, the floor is yours.
Okay, am I sharing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this okay? Okay. It always takes a little moment. Okay, so thank you so much for allowing me to participate, and apologies that I can't be there in person. I'm actually giving this paper during the lunch break of the International Medieval Congress, and I'm going to have to leave a little bit early because I'm actually chairing a session, two sessions on Jewish heritage here. So it's all a little bit of a race. So these are just very, very provisional notes. It's more a research agenda, a research in progress. There's quite a lot of it that I haven't done. So please forgive me if this is all very sketchy. I think my overall kind of sort of idea is, and I will just talk us through this slide very quickly. How do we name what we're studying? And I've put up here the the various names of Lviv, historical names. There are probably others, and I should probably do some in Hebrew letters. But this is just an indication. There is, of course, a war going on, which is terrible and which actually has been probably going on much longer than the calendar shows, a kind of an ongoing attrition and aggression. And in this current struggle, I think, it's understandable that people are moved by a form of national belonging, national pride, national activism, and so I think it's a real challenge. And this is not the case only in the Ukraine. This is the case in many places. I'm not going to mention the Middle East. Oh no, I've just mentioned it. I'm sorry. How can we think of a transnational way of thinking about these elusive subjects? And I'm thinking here of the concept of the borderland that has been invoked by Cyril Amar's work on Lviv. How can we think of a transnational way of thinking about these elusive subjects without either erasing or policing national or nationality boundaries? So this is a very difficult and sensitive subject. And of course, as a non-Ukrainian national, I have to be particularly sensitive and careful. How then do we also work with the accidents of provenance or survival? I use the word survival in inverted commas, because I always feel a little uneasy about talking about survival in a place where so many people were killed in quite a brutal way, including the main one of the protagonists of my talk, Debora Vogel. So we're talking about the survival of material heritage and the loss of people, and that's a very difficult thing to talk about. A major example is, of course, what you can see in the image, which was an exhibition based very much on the Goldstein collection, Maximilian Goldstein's collection, that sort of reappeared or resurfaced after the fall of communism, and that was then exhibited widely, as in this exhibition at Beit Hatfutzot in the 90s, I think. And how we led by this these accidents of survival? How do we work with loss and dispersal? And how do we reconcile the multiple and conflicting histories, those of Poland, Polish, Lithuanian, Commonwealth, Galicia, and Ukraine? I'm saying this because I'm talking about Lviv, which is very difficult for me to say because my mother lived there as a young woman, and of course the name was always Lvov in the Soviet pronunciation, but of course then I have Polish friends who don't recognize that pronunciation at all. So I'm going to skip this because it's and I'm going to focus on Debora Fogel and her work about the Jewish quarter of Lviv that was published between 1935 and 1937. And I'm trying to get my head around this tricky identity of somebody writing poetry in Yiddish, writing prose in Polish, but with very deep familial roots in Lviv, and trying at the same time to be a modernist. So looking back, I'm going to show the obvious, which is that her work about the Jewish quarter of Lviv is completely different. It's miles away from the work of, for example, Meyer Balaban. I'm just showing here on the left his work on the Jewish quarter, and its history and remains. That was published in 1909, and equally different from the report, which is a kind of guide, in effect, of the curatorium for the care of the remains of Jewish art in the Jewish community in Lvov. That was published in 1928. So even 1928, which is only a few years before Debora Fogel, is very different in its approach. I'm sorry, I'm just going to move you so that I can see my own screen. Here, I'm going to move you to the top. Okay, so here are just a few snapshots or pages from Meyer Balaban's work, and you can see, I think, straight away. I'm going to especially, I'm going to use the illustrations to make my point. Which is that he starts with a factual historical map from the 18th century, and he then gives kind of photogravures. So this is the technology that was available to him in the 1900s. That is the first decades of the 20th century. And I'd just like you to remember this view of the so-called Golden Rose synagogue, the Nachmanovich synagogue, and then some of these views of the interior and the details, because I'll come back to them later. I won't today talk about Goldstein because there's so much work about him. Except to say very briefly that there is a world of difference in aesthetic between his approach to collecting Jewish culture and history and Debora Fogel's approach. So I think what I'm trying to say with that is that this is not just a matter of chronology. It's not just a matter of Balaban having worked 30 years earlier. These quite fundamental splits in aesthetic and the approach to what do we mean by Jewish culture and art only get sharper, and they have a lot, I think, to do with the modernization of the Jews of Lviv, which was then Lwów and was a Polish city in the interwar period. Okay, so I'm going to skip this, and I would like to talk a little bit about the work that Debora Vogel, a noted Yiddish poet who was really a Polish speaker, but taught herself deliberately, as a deliberate move, she taught herself Yiddish, and she wrote poetry in Yiddish, though prose in Polish, and who in fact was in correspondence with her friend Bruno Schulz, telling him off for not writing in Yiddish, and and just stick. She wanted to bring more people to Yiddish. So this extended essay, which is described as a blueprint, a kind of, it's the Polish name is expozycja, but I would probably translate it as a kind of blueprint or a plan for a monograph about Jewish Lviv, which of course never happened because just like Bruno Schulz, Debora Vogel was murdered during the Holocaust, in Vogel's case in the Lviv ghetto, as far as we know, with her family. So I'm just going to give you a quick impression, and my interest again is, I mean, I've got a translation here. There are translations, and I think it remains a challenge because of the way that Debora Vogel plays with language. So I'm just going to draw your attention to the use of the word juderia, which there are Polish speakers here, and I would like you to correct me, but I think she is deliberately using an exotic term, unlike, right? She could have chosen the Polish word for the Jewish quarter, as Balaban did, but she isn't doing that. She is. By the way, is my PowerPoint moving? Is my PowerPoint? Are the slides moving?
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's moving.
Okay, good. Because it's just one of these things. Sometimes, you get to slide 16 and suddenly people say, "Oh, wait, we're still seeing your first slide." Okay, thanks. So the term juderia, I think, is a deliberate choice of an exotic term, which I associate with the word for Jewish quarter, which is used in the Sephardi context. And I'd like to think a little bit more about why she is using that term. And she does at the end, show that she is talking about a world which she considers to be exotic. But there are also moments of Yiddish that come into the language when she quotes direct kind of speech, vernacular speech, such as here in the middle of this first page, kupuje stare szmaty. I think of szmaty as szmatas, as derived from Yiddish. So it's these kind of things. So she starts off with with giving an impression of center and periphery. And I'm just going to use a translation that I've got here. Center and periphery have always existed, elastic and static, life that flows by in still flattened wave. This applies to the Euderia of the Lvov Euderia. I'm not translating it deliberately. And to all Jewish neighborhoods or all Jewish quarters in the world, which always lie slightly off of life's beaten path. And then she proceeds to give a kind of almost a Baudelaire-like impressionistic view of the streets of what she calls Jewish Lviv. And it's mostly a very modernist kind of idiom, which is not a guidebook, with the tiny exception of her discussion of one of the oldest, I'm quoting now, here is one of the oldest synagogues in Lviv, the Golden Rose. Sloping beams support its walls. The entryway is decorated by a single leaf ornament, and inside is a beautiful altar. She talks about an altar in the Renaissance style. And then she proceeds to just repeat the popular myth or legend about the synagogue. I'm quoting, this synagogue built in 1582 has its own legends, its own gleam. Just a minute. Here's another view. Its own gleam. It is said that a beautiful Jewish widow, Rosa, sacrificed herself to spare the synagogue from the violence of the Jesuits. Thereafter, she committed suicide inside the synagogue, inside the shul, which has borne her name ever since. That is the only thing she has to say about what we would call monuments, such as synagogues, pretty much. Other than that, she's talking about these really quite run-down and slightly depressing streets. In fact, even where she talks about the Platz Theodora, just a minute, she says it has the nickname of Paris. I'm not going to read it out now. It has commonly the nickname of Paris, but it's basically, she says, it's nothing like Paris. It's it's quite a depressing and kind of degraded place compared to. Here you are. Yeah, it's called Paris in suburban slang. There is no doubt that it dominates the area, an empty, irregular space full of strange figures. It is an expanse of sundry cheap life, hawked wares, a zone of insecurity and indifference. It is in the style of Berlin's Alexanderplatz or Montmartre in Paris, but a Jewish version. A Jewish version. So it's full of overwhelming sadness and lack of faith, utterly devoid of the sweeping, decisive galvanization that imprints certainty and stability of existence onto one's lump of life. So these are just a couple of examples, and as you've probably noticed, I'm contrasting the work that Fogel does with the work that on the right you can see at the top a piece from Balaban, from Balaban's work, a page from Balaban's work showing the great urban synagogue. There is nothing about the two communities, the urban and the suburban community in Lviv, nor and even what she says about the synagogue is not historical. She's just sort of briefly repeating the myth, which I think is thoroughly debunked by the work of historians. Okay, so I'm in each case I'm sort of contrasting. So here you can, in the case of the Golden Rose, you can see that the artwork that Vogel's publication includes is actually fairly close to the print that is used by Balaban, but that's the exception. Everything else are just these really kind of depressing street views with impoverished Jews eking out their living. What are the images? The images are etchings by Józefa Kratochwil-Widimski, and I've tracked down her grave at the Likhachev cemetery in Lviv. She was not Jewish, and I've found another etching which was not used, coal cellar from Boimov Street. Boimov Street is today Staroyevreyskaya, I understand, but people can correct me if that's wrong. And there is simply no sense of what we would call the monuments of Jewish heritage. So I'm going to use the remaining. Have I got another minute? No, I don't. Okay, I was going to use the remaining minutes to show the kind of modernist environment and the collaborators with whom, the artistic collaborators with whom Debora Vogel normally worked together. Henryk Streng was a Jewish artist who survived under false name as Marek Włodarski and then kept that Polish name for the rest of his life in post-war Poland. He's been sort of recently rediscovered. You can also see his interest in photomontage, which was something that Debora Vogel was a theorist of and was particularly interested. So here you can see a completely different vision of modernity, another painting by Streng and Włodarski. And finally, I would have talked about the first director of Lviv's Jewish Museum, who managed to move to Paris in the year in which this work by Debora Vogel was published, and who was an artist, but who was also a collector. And the work that I would like to do next would be to look at the Donation Lille. He became from Ludwig, he became Louis, and to look more closely at the provenance of the Judaica that he donated to the Jewish Museum in Paris, the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme, over the years. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Eva. Eva, do you have time to answer questions? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Colleagues, Eva needs to leave us in a few minutes, so
it's okay. I can stay on a bit. It's fine.
Oh, great. If anybody has questions, please put them. Małgorzata. Małgorzata, and after her, Dr. Serhiy Kravtsov. Małgorzata.
Yes, thank you very much for this interesting presentation, and I feel obliged as a Polish-speaking person to answer your question. As a first of all, both term expozycja and Juderia, they are not like proper Polish words, I think. I mean, maybe expozycja is archaic Polish words, but it does not exist in the Polish language anymore. I think this might come from the language of photography. And we know that Debora Fogel, but this is just on my idea, that because Debora was very much interested, involved in working with the photomontage and with the new techniques, and maybe it comes from the language of photography. And Juderia, this is not a Polish word at all. This sounds more Spanish, and I think this is, in fact, the probably comes maybe from Ladino or from Spanish, and it describes the Jewish quarter in a Spanish land. It would be interesting to analyze and to research why she decided to use this particular term with regards to the Lviv. Why would she compare it in a way to this Sephardi environment? Yes, and I'm sure you know, it just wasn't enough time, that this image of the city is one of the issues that she was particularly involved. And even if we read this entry of her book, the difference between the city, between the center and the periphery, that was one of the main issues in her all creative works. And this is the idea that she shared with Bruno Schulz. This tension between the peripheries that are sometimes poor but very mysterious. They are, yes, they are the realm of different spirits, while the center is something that is, yes, more official. So I think this is just my reflection, and I'm sure you also know that some few years ago, I think it was 2016, there was a very interesting exhibition in Łódź in the Museum of Modern Art. You know, so okay. So
which one? Which exhibition was this?
The exhibition on Debora Fogel and her network of different artists. Yes. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
The only thing, I didn't see it, unfortunately. And if you have an idea how I can get hold of any catalog or any documentation, I would be grateful.
I think it's still, the catalog should be available, yes, but still in Poland, but maybe on Amazon, should be available to buy. And yes, the Andriy Boyarov from Lviv was involved in this exhibition as a curator, and Karolina Szymaniak from Warsaw/Wrocław was a co-curator. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Małgorzata. Dr. Kravtsov, please.
So I will use my privilege of being born in Lviv and knowing that area pretty well. I left that city when I was 40. Let's say I've written 2 books about Golden Rose. But
I have it. I have one of your books.
One. The second has not been published, unfortunately. It's an under a mice. Okay, but I should tell you, she speaks about the Krakowian suburb, the northern suburb. She doesn't refer to the history. She says simply druga grupa zaułków, another group of alleys. And then she moves to Żółkiewska, which goes to the north, was the main street of that suburb. And she says about her great-grandfather, Nasali Zyz, who was a Kabbalist and a Silk Jew who lived there, and so on and so forth. It all happens in that very historical area, the pre-Kazimierz Wielki area of Lviv. And I know that story pretty well. My parents and grandparents lived in Slunechna, which she also mentions there I don't have to tell my family story in brief, but she touches without penetrating history. But everything is, it's difficult to say that it is impressionist or expressionist. According to the period, it would be more expressionist, but you are right. It's pretty impressionist. And just with a broad brush, some strikes of a broad brush. It's very nice. Despite typos like when the synagogue was built, and you have corrected when you quoted it, it is typed 1528, but it is 1582. But never mind. We understand what does she mean. It's a very nice text indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I think the challenge for me is how to understand that as also part of the engagement with Jewish heritage, but a kind of almost diametrically opposed to the kind of work that the Kuratorium or Goldstein are doing. Right? Is there any way that this work can be included? That's, I'm not saying that there's an answer, but it's a different side. And if I think about Ludwig Lille, or later Louis, as somehow being between these two worlds, right? Because he is both a modernist artist of the kind of, the type like, the world that Vogel and Henrik Streng work in and move in, and he becomes the museum director of the Jewish Museum and then a Judaica collector. So there is this bridge, and I think it's particularly interesting to think about that as a challenge.
Yes, you're right. People who organized the Kuratorium, the Commission for Protection of Jewish Art, and the museum, these were the same people. Actually, it was the same group of people who pushed Goldstein aside because he was not a very, very communicative person, actually, and he has his ideas, huge ego. But we should not penetrate this. They're very rational, with Avin at the head of this restoration section of the commission. They wanted to push aside everybody who meant himself as a folk artist just to earn few grushim, as we say in Israel, by repainting some old painting. They just did everything in their abilities to bar such people from touching the authentic monuments as they understood, and they were authentic monuments. In this point, Goldstein is very different from Avin, because Goldstein loves Zak, the so-called folk artist who produced some souvenirs for Goldstein with his name and saying that he's a descendant of Turei Zahav and so on and so forth. They had absolutely different worldviews on what is the continuation of Jewish art, what is Jewish art and what is just folkish or whatever. And Debora Fogel is something else at all. She doesn't fit in between. I didn't think that much about Debora Fogel as about Avin. I'm working on a book about him, but she is very, very, very different. She's different. Avin is close to Zofia Maizenova in Krakow, an art historian, a professional art historian. Though he's an engineer, he's an architect, he's a contractor, he's a builder, but he is not close to he would say jargon on Yiddish and would write jargon. He was somebody educated in Vienna and Munich. he won't like these things. Probably he accepted it, but not he didn't belong to that group.
No. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kravtsov. I need to invite our, thank you, Eva. Thank you for great presentation. I have to invite our next speaker, and our next speaker is Professor Mirjam Rajner. She teaches at the Jewish Art Department at the Bar-Ilan University, Israel. And the title of her presentation is Images of Victimization in Jewish East European Modern and Avant-Garde Art. Mirjam, you have the floor.
Yes, before I share my PowerPoint, first, thank you very much for including me into this wonderful conference, and thank you, Evgeny, for inviting me especially. I just want to warn you, I'm bringing my paper to current situation in Israel, and I will be juxtaposing the images from Eastern European art of the even early 20th century avant-garde to the work of Zoya Cherkassky, who is of Ukrainian, Kyiv. She was born in Kyiv, Ukrainian Jewish artist, currently living in Israel, and to her exceptional series that she created in response to the October 7th attack of Hamas on Israeli citizens. So I apologize in advance for some of the images that might be not agreeable or difficult to look at, especially in the current situation. So I'm sharing my PowerPoint. Okay, can you all see it well? All right.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the renowned saying, during the war, the muses are silent, stands in stark opposition to reality. Often destruction brings forth its opposite, artistic creation as affirmation of life, one's own, or as a need for preservation and documentation for posterity. Currently raging devastating wars of our own times invite us to look once again in these processes and rethink our own positions. Let us start with memorialization of the World War I. The centennial of this war inspired several major exhibitions reflecting upon the influences of the hitherto unknown horrors of contemporary warfare upon modern art. The one held at the Metropolitan Museum in New York between autumn and winter 2017 and 18, entitled World War I and the Visual Arts, explored works on paper such as drawings, prints, photographs, and posters, which range from quotation from the catalog, expressions of bellicose enthusiasm, to sentiments of regret, grief, and anger. Jewish venues tackled the subject as well, but preferred to showcase Jewish participation in the Great War as sign of successful integration into the host nation and expression of patriotism and loyalty. Thus, Center for Jewish History in New York hosted between November 2014 and February 2015 a series of events dedicated to the subject of World War I and the Jews, while the accompanying exhibition held at the Leo Baeck Institute focused upon meeting between the acculturated German and Austro-Hungarian Jewish soldiers and the traditional Jewish world on the East Front, famously presented by Arnold Zweig's and Hermann Struck's album entitled Das Ostjüdische Antlitz, The Face of East European Jewry. Works of art referring to East European Jewish suffering and victimhood were not exhibited at the time. However, many such scenes were captured from the early 20th century on by the East European Jewish artists. while using a variety of stylistic languages, from realism and impressionism to avant-garde primitivism and Cubo-futurism. Those artists left behind a body of work that eventually anticipated the now well-established genre of Holocaust art. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, and the opening of the new research venues, much has been revealed about the various aspects of East European Jewish life. As a historian of modern Jewish art and visual culture, I have enjoyed exploring the complex contexts in which East European artists of Jewish origin worked. Thus, Samuel Hirschenberg, Leopold Pilichovsky, Maurycy Minkowski, Marc Chagall, and Yisakhar Ryback, to mention some of the artists that we will encounter, were worldly and secular, working and moving between art centers such as Warsaw and Krakow, Kyiv and Moscow, Munich, Berlin, Paris, and Jerusalem. While taking part in a Jewish cultural renaissance and development of the modern Jewish consciousness, they were also striving to be universal artists, took part in international exhibitions, and were members of the European modernist groups. Today, coming from a region involved in a devastating war, still without a prospect for an ending and the establishment of a just peace, I will look only at one aspect of these artists' creations, their works responding to the subject of exile, migration, and persecution. I'm aware that by doing this, I'm reviving a long-abandoned and often criticized lachrymose attitude towards Jewish history and creative activity, and am at the moment letting aside the celebration of integration and fruitful discourse with one's surroundings, subjects that I myself eagerly research and write about. It is a temporary decision, we hope, in order to be able to juxtapose such art to the work of Zoya Cherkassky, a contemporary female Israeli artist of Jewish-Ukrainian origin, who promptly and in a unique way responded to the October 7, 2023 Hamas-led massacre. As we shall see, Cherkassky tied the tragic event to both universal images of suffering and to the East European Jewish artworks relating to the Jewish suffering. Thus, she created, as I would like to argue, a new chapter not only in Israeli, but also of contemporary Jewish art. Zoya Cherkassky-Nadi was born in Kyiv in 1976, immigrated to Israel together with her family in 1991 at the age of 15, just 2 weeks before the collapse of the Soviet Union. From 2010 on, she has captured a controversial place in the Israeli art scene, primarily due to her artwork exploring unconventional topics in a spirit of social criticism, often imbued with humor and biting satire, difficulties in adjusting to Israeli life after migration, a nostalgic view of childhood in Soviet Union, now shattered by the war in Ukraine, and there is an entire series that she created in the reaction to the Ukrainian war. I'm just showing here 2 works. And identification with the African community and asylum seekers and migrant workers living in Tel Aviv, to which she is also tied due to her marriage to a migrant from Nigeria. In her works, painted in deliberately crude, colorful styles, sometimes compared to Soviet posters, Cherkassky continuously relates to questions of identity, otherness, and alienation. She was also among the first artists to respond to the October 7 Hamas-led brutal attack on Israeli citizens by creating now already often shown and referred to series of 12 works entitled October 7, 2023. Let me show just a few of works closer. This is the entire series, and these are some images separately, but belong to the same series. I'm sure you're already familiar. Some of Cherkassky's images clearly use icons and themes well known to a Western viewer, such as Picasso's anti-war Guernica, or Munch's Scream, or traditional Christian iconography, such as the Massacre of the Innocents, here by Giotto. By doing so, Zoya added to her depictions a wider content, wishing to arouse the world's attention. But in addition to such visual quotations, the artist also created a dialogue with images known in Jewish art, a practice she has used before. For example, in response to an attack by Jewish settlers on the Palestinian village Huwara in the West Bank in February 2023, she turned to Chagall's work responding to the destruction of the East European shtetl. Now, in reacting to Jewish victims, the case in point is the work entitled Simchat Torah, which commemorates the unfortunate timing of the attack, the eve of the Simchat Torah, rejoicing of the Torah holiday, an attack which turned the anticipated celebrations into a tragedy. Cherkassky showed in her work a group of attack survivors, elderly men, women, children, and a baby. Some of them are armed to protect themselves, while a single female soldier leads them away from the burning landscape. Consciously or subconsciously, the artist based her work upon a well-known icon of Jewish victimhood. By doing so, she tied the events of October 7, in spite of their contemporary Israeliness, to the Jewish diasporic past, as formulated here by the Polish Jewish sculptor Nathan Rappaport in his renowned monuments in Warsaw and Jerusalem, commemorating the Holocaust. The armed Nazis, helmets on their heads, leading Jews to their final destination, visible in Rappaport's procession, are exchanged by Zoya with civilians who are armed and a young woman soldier who protects them. The presence of the female Israeli soldier wearing a uniform tests that this is not a Holocaust scene occurring in the diaspora, but in a Jewish state where citizens are supposed to be protected by the army. Cherkassky turned to a known image of Jewish suffering and helplessness in order to depict an event in which the number of civilian victims and kidnapped hostages were unprecedented in Israeli history. Rappaport, too, in creating his relief that referred to Jewish suffering during the Holocaust, turned to an earlier image for inspiration, specifically to the well-known painting by Samuel Hirschenberg, a Polish Jewish artist active in 20th century Europe and Palestine. Hirschenberg had begun work on this painting already in 1899, together with his monumental and frightening Wandering Jew. They were prepared for the 1900 Universal Exhibition in Paris and were meant to be exhibited together. By painting them, Hirschenberg seemed to have been reacting to the anti-Semitic caricature published in the Parisian journal La Pèlerin as a comment about the mass emigration of Jews from Russia to America, especially in the aftermath of the expulsion of Jews from Moscow. Mocking a church triptych, the caricature shows on the right side the Russian Tsar with a whip in his hand ordering the Jews out. The Jews leaving in a long procession and carry with them their possessions are accompanied in the lower center, traditionally depicted Wandering Jew, and observed from above by Christ carrying the cross. A reminder of Jewish guilt and the punishment they have to endure, exile, and eternal wonder. In the left panel, the procession arrives to the shores of the ocean, where on the other side, awaiting them with open arms, is Uncle Sam, the symbol of America. The movement of the procession from right to left signifies the actual direction of Jewish immigration from the east to the west. However, eventually, Hirschenberg's Wandering Jew, based on Christian legend and more universal in character, was exhibited in Paris alone and even won a bronze medal, while the exile, perhaps considered too contemporary and problematic, remained in the artist's studio. In his exile, Hirschenberg depicted an entire community of East European traditional Jews comprised of men, women, and children as they walk through a desolate, snow-covered landscape. A man, possibly a portrait of artist himself, is shown carrying a Torah scroll, the symbol of a spiritual continuity, while a little girl next to him, carrying a tea kettle, symbolizes physical continuity. The procession is led by the old rabbi and accompanied by a man walking in the middle, holding a walking stick, and once again recalling the wandering Jew, not the image of an accursed figure from the Christian legend, as in the Pelerin caricature, but an elderly Jew accompanying his people. In the aftermath of the 1903 Kishinev pogrom, the painting Exile, which Hirschenberg finished and exhibited only in 1904, acquired a new interpretation. In contrast to anti-Jewish attacks occurring in 19th century Tsarist Russia, the Kishinev pogrom, erupting at the onset of the 20th century, received wide attention from the Jewish nationalist groups and was documented by photographs published in Jewish press. As the result, it raised protests and sympathy among the Jewish and non-Jewish public in Europe and the United States, and became, until the Holocaust, the archetype for Jewish institution, inspiring works of literature and art. For instance, the artist Ephraim Moshe Lillian responded to it with an image that reminds one of crucifixion. An old bearded Jew wrapped in a tallit, tied and burning at a stake, forms the shape of a cross with angels' wings spreading behind his head. Jewish victimhood is thus implicitly compared to Christ's, calling for universal condemnation. It was also at this time that Hirschenberg's painting became, in Zionist eyes, not only a depiction of the East European Jewish immigration, but a call for the negation of the entire pattern of Jewish life in diaspora, which was now perceived as marked by perpetually demeaning acceptance of suffering and misery. This was the message Hirschenberg's painting was meant to convey when reproduced in numerous reproductions and postcards disseminated by Zionist circles in Europe and Palestine, even during the Holocaust. If we now look again at Rappaport's and Cherkassky's work, we can notice modification of the central characters shown in Hirschenberg's painting, primarily of the man carrying the Torah scroll and the wandering Jew. In Rappaport's relief, the Torah is carried by a character reminding of a biblical patriarch standing in the middle, more as a metaphor than a real person. In contrast, Cherkassky introduced entirely contemporary narrative. In her work, Torah is carried by a young girl instead of a domestic cattle at the front of the procession, accompanied by a female soldier and a small boy. While referring to the timing of the October 7 massacre, the Jewish holiday Simchat Torah, when Torah is traditionally carried around in a synagogue by dancing and rejoicing male Jews, the fact that in her painting a girl carries it refers to an ongoing tension in Israel between a ruling Orthodox tradition and opposing liberal ones, Reform and Conservative, which preach equality and inclusion of women in all forms of religious services, including studying, reading, and carrying Torah scrolls. Similarly, the role of the wandering Jew differs from the one in Hirschenberg's work. While in Rappaport's work, he leads the procession, supporting himself with a cane, with a sack on his shoulder, recalling a Jew deported by Nazis. Cherkassky returns to Hirschenberg's central position, but instead of the mythical male character, she depicts an elderly woman supporting herself with a cane in a contemporary home-looking floral dress and slippers, reminding that she was taken away from her kibbutz home. Her image creates a strong contrast with the armed men and women and the burning fire in the background. Cherkassky thus used and adapts the well-known Jewish icon for a contemporary gender-sensitive work, which, while preserving the tradition, responds to the current victimization. Furthermore, in contrast to the depiction of the survivors, Dvoyre presented the female hostages being taken to Gaza as procession moving into the opposite direction, as still resonating the division in the French caricature, where the right side of the troop symbolized the side of Russia, the East, and the oppression, while movement towards the left meant salvation. Among the hostages is the elderly woman supporting herself by a cane, whose arm bears the true number from Auschwitz. A Holocaust survivor, it must have suspected to have Jewish origin. Hirschenberg's legacy was continued in the art created after the 1905 revolution in Russia, when a huge wave of unrest shook the country and brought about an outburst of anti-Jewish violence. Equating Jews with revolution, supporters of the Tsar and the government organized in notorious Black Hundreds, attacked Jews and other groups like students and rural teachers suspected of disloyalty. Counter-revolutionary riots and sporadic violence claimed hundreds of Jewish victims throughout the Pale of Settlement. The 1905 revolution and its brutal suppression had a strong impact on contemporary Russian and Jewish artists. Now fleeing refugees and injured victims appeared in the canvases of Russian and Polish Jewish artists like Abel Pan, Leopold Pilichowski, and Maurycy Minkowski. Depicted realistically, often based upon sketches drawn in situ by the artists visiting the sites of the atrocities, they document an era. In the upheaval during the last days of the Soviet Union, Cherkassky witnessed the upsurge of nationalism and clericalism accompanied by anti-Semitism. The resurgence of a new version of the Black Hundreds and anti-Jewish slogans in the 1990s, recalled the past persecution of the East European Jews, poignantly depicted in a Russian caricature published in an anti-Tsarist magazine in 1907. Then, as in the 1990s, immigration offered a chance for better life. Thus, the cover of Yiddischer Immigrant, Jewish Immigrant, published in 1909 in New York, is a compelling pastiche of visual source. The long column of East European Jews walking towards the viewer while carrying the possessions and their possessions in a Torah scroll is based on a work by Lillian, while once again paraphrasing Hirschenberg's Exile. Similarly, the encounter between the immigrant who just crossed the ocean and the female personification of America opening the gate for him is a reversal of Lillian's wandering Jew standing on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea as he observes longingly birds migrating to the south in the direction of the land of Israel. Once again, Cherkassky, in one of her early installations, tackled the same subject of wandering and immigration, now referring to the 1990s exodus of almost 1 million of former Soviet Jews to the state of Israel. In the artist's work, a contemporary-looking immigrant sitting on the packed suitcases is clutching a velvet bag decorated with a Star of David that reveals his Jewish identity and explains the reason for his immigration. It contains tefillin, phylacteries, worn by Jewish men in prayer as a reminder of God's intervention at the time of the exodus from Egypt. The candles of a menorah are burned out, and a soul comforter, a little pillow, he will take, it's embroidered with an anti-Semitic caricature of a wandering Jew. Moreover, Steinmetz wearing the traditional Jews decorating the folding screen themselves have the wings of the black migrant birds that Lillian's wanderer had observed as they flew to the Promised Land. The persecution of East European Jews continued through the turbulent period of World War I, the Revolution, and the subsequent civil war in Russia. The most appalling depictions of East European Jewish suffering during the World War I were left by Abba Hefferman, better known as Abel Pan, an artist associated with early Bezalel School of Arts and Crafts. At the beginning of the war, Pan found himself in Paris. It was there that he created a series of pastels expressing his horror about the pogroms perpetrated against the Jews. The drawings were meant to be kind of journalistic documentation, but were published only after the war. A number of Pan's renderings include images of raped women, the tragic topic much discussed during the current war against Hamas and depicted also by Cherkassky, who used photographs and video footages as the base for her. The atrocities committed during the World War I were further intensified during the tumultuous time of the Russian Civil War, continuing in Russia and Ukraine between 1918 and 21. A little now harrowing series created by Yisakhar Ryback, a Jewish Ukrainian avant-garde artist that we will hear about after my presentation, active at the time of the Russian Revolution in its aftermath, refer to these tragic events. So I'll show you again the entire series that, as I said, comprised 9 images. Using an avant-garde primitive style imbued with Cubo-futurism characteristic for his early artistic opus, Ryback powerfully responded to Jewish persecution with 9 unique works, nowadays preserved at the Mishkan Leomanut Museum in Ein-Harod. Cherkassky's series, created in the response to October 7th attack, was thus not created in an artistic vacuum. Although responding to a murderous event so far unknown in the history of Israeli-Arab conflict, the victimization of Israeli civilians follows a long and difficult history of pre-state anti-Jewish assault. By choosing parallels with the past, the series is posited in a historical context rather than the current post-colonial discourse. But let me conclude with a different Cherkassky's painting, an apparently unassuming still life with a salad. The choice of food, plants, and objects in this painting tells much about Zoya's and Israeli's multiple identity. On the table next to each other appear a Russian teapot cup with the face of a black man and African cocoa pots with cactus, the local tzabar, and a healing aloe vera, oriental eggplants and red berries, onion and cherries, and of course the salad in a bowl known as both Israeli and Arab salad. The simultaneous presence of diverse elements in all their variety, the tension, but also mutual acknowledgement, is creative, enriching, and inspiring. Let us hope that the nowadays profoundly disturbed balance between them will eventually be restored and that peaceful coexistence, in spite of it, will be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation. I think we will not change the format of our sessions for questions. So if anybody has a question, please. Yeah, Vitaly?
Yeah. Thank you for this great presentation, Mirjam. Can you hear me without
yes, I'm listening.
Okay, so no, I have no questions. I just want to give you some interesting information about Zoya Cherkassky, or we know her full last name is Cherkassky Nadi. And she was born in Kyiv in the 70s and migrated to Israel in 1991. So it's interesting that her reflections, so like the reflections on the war against Israel starting last October, also Zoya reflected the Russia's war on Ukraine, maybe you know, and recently
I showed 2 images and I said that there is a series.
For the first time was translated into Ukrainian and then published, and Zoya was invited to illustrate this Ukrainian Haggadah, and it was recently published. I will give you a link to the chat in a while if you're interested in.
Okay, thank you very much. The Ukrainian series that she painted immediately after the beginning of the war, of the attack of Russia on Ukraine, I showed 2 images, and I showed like she juxtaposed the new situation and the new reality with her all the nostalgic images of a Soviet time, of her Soviet childhood. And it's shown how it's actually exploding and disappearing. So I showed, if you notice, 2 images like this, and I mentioned that it's an entire series that she created immediately upon the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. And the Haggadah I heard of, but I didn't see it, so I would be very grateful if I can see it as well. Thank
you. We have another question from Dr. Małgorzata Stolarska-Fronia. Małgorzata, please.
Yes, thank you, Mirjam, for this extremely interesting presentation, very contemporary indeed. And the way you showed how the artist used in a very sophisticated way those quotations from different iconographical sources, from Jewish and non-Jewish. Therefore, I have no remarks or questions to the content of your presentation because I think it was very good. What I'm interested in is what is the reception of her art in Israel, because the language that she uses, it's the language I think it's on the edge of I would say the comic art, the primitive art, maybe street art.
Yeah.
What is her reception in Israel and maybe abroad?
Yeah, okay. So first of all, she created this series in Berlin. After the attack, she left with her daughter and spent 2 or 3 months in Berlin, and she created it there. And right upon return in December, it was shown in Rosenberg Gallery in Tel Aviv, which is a gallery that anyway presents her work from 2010 on. And it received reception, but not as widely as abroad, not because of a style. The style is her style. She uses this style all from, I would say, 2004. She works in this style that I try to compare a little bit to Soviet avant-garde posters and primitivism, as you say. That's her style. So she didn't change the style. What happened since then in Israel, that is a mass of contemporary Israeli artists are reacting to situation, including the attack of October 7th. And she just became part of, there are many, many artists that are now working on that subject, exhibiting or online or even at the museums already. Tel Aviv Museum and galleries, of course, are showing their art as well, which are much more contemporary than what she does, right, in terms of style. But in Vienna, she was in a show window shown immediately after she created, not the originals, the copies, but this series was shown in Vienna Jewish Museum on the street, like there's a window that faces the street. Mm-hmm. And the originals were shown in the Jewish Museum in New York, also in December 2023, where it had mixed reception. There were already split in public, so that while there was viewing at the museum that included talk with the current director, James Snyder, who used to be a director of Israel Museum and now is the director of the Jewish Museum in New York, and who invited Zoya. They had planned talk about the series. Demonstrations erupted. People bought the tickets falsely and tried to interrupt the event, which you can see it online. And they presented the whole work and the museum that invited her as part of the post-colonial attitude and accused for spreading. I mean, we know all this from the news, from the university encampments in America and so on. So aside from that, aside from these 2 places, I think there was much talk online, and there are different sites that showed this series, and many articles were written about it since then. But physically, I'm not aware that it was shown elsewhere, like a real exhibition, aside from these 3 instances that I mentioned.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have yet one question, and it will be the last question from Dr. Listos Jelinek. Listos, please.
Thank you. Eva, I would like to know from you if you would categorize the work or the intervention, let's say, of Dvora Vogel into a mainly male discussion as a feminist issue. And Mirjam, I would like to know from you if there are more Israeli artists from this or even a younger generation which who try to express themselves in a more, I don't know if it's the right word, but like comic-like art, because it is something that, you know, comes up in the recent years. I think it has become very, very popular to deal with serious issues in this naive or like way. So, and I wonder, is it common in Israel too? Because I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I am not the right person to ask. I'm not historian of Israeli art and art critic, or not dealing with contemporary Israeli art. I just took on Zoya because I suddenly realized how much of the traditional Jewish art, especially East European Jewish art, she's using and quoting. And she has this very long history of coming from Eastern Europe, and also in other works that I didn't show, being very, very knowledgeable of East European Jewish art, especially avant-garde art of the 20s and early. So I'm not really the person to ask, but I do know that there are novels, like graphic novels as elsewhere, being produced as well in Israel. Okay, but I cannot really tell you exactly the names, or I'm not a person, but I know that they're doing that in Israel as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And I am pleased to introduce our last participant of this panel, Dr. Małgorzata Stolarska-Fronia. She's an art historian and research associate at the University of Potsdam in Germany. And the topic of her presentation is Yisakhar Ryback between Kyiv and Berlin. Małgorzata, the floor is yours. Unmute, please. You're unmuted.
Thank you very much. First question, do you see my presentation?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me for this conference. Very important, I think, in contemporary times. Many faces that I saw on the screen yesterday are the people that I know for over a decade and met on the conferences from Warsaw to Jerusalem, Bar Ilan, and it was very nice to meet you, especially my Ukrainian and Israeli friends. So I'm very happy to be part of this endeavor, and congratulations on the idea. And today I will present you my reflections actually on Yisakhar Ryback. And this is quite brave endeavor to talk about Ryback. Luckily, I haven't chosen Lissitzky because I don't think there is much one can tell, much new one can tell about Lissitzky. But the reason why I'm dealing with Ryback, it's connected with my current project, which concerns mapping the Jewish avant-garde. So I'm mainly investigating how this network of Jewish avant-garde artists that was spanned between Kyiv, Warsaw, Łódź, Bucharest, Berlin, Paris, how it functioned. And of course, Yisakhar Ryback is the artist that, one of the artists that most notably represents this entanglement of the European avant-garde in general, the avant-garde of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and the Jewish avant-garde too. You know, they are like two realms that were entangled together and entangled within themselves. So this is why Ryback is so interesting for me, because in this network, Ryback represented all the possible problems and questions that might beset a researcher exploring Jewish avant-garde art, which is, what was its specificity of the Jewish avant-garde? What was universal and what was explicitly Jewish? How to reconcile various, sometimes contrasting ideological options and influences? And is it possible at all to clearly define the cultural identity of avant-garde Jewish artists? And more importantly, is such an essentialistic approach necessary and possible? So my presentation will offer some preliminary reflections on mapping the Jewish avant-garde in Central and Eastern Europe using the persona of Yisakhar Ryback as a case study in order to show the complexity and entanglements of Jewish artists in the question of national and cultural belonging, and how this entanglement was reflected in a discourse about them, especially with regards to the German Jewish milieu and their favorite romanticized label for Eastern European artists, which was the Künstler artist Ostjude. At the end, I would also like to share with you some reflections on how these imposed identities dilemma permitted also very recent biographies of Ryback. And I found the introduction of Eva Frojmovic very similar to my approach and very appealing, how, especially in the contemporary political situation, how we define particular artists that actually worked in different milieus and worked at the edges, and how do we deal with some imposed national categories. Yisakhar Ryback was born in 1897 in Yelisavetgrad, then in Russian Empire, today Kropivnitsi, in Ukraine, and died in 1935 in Paris. He spent his formative years for his work in Kyiv, where he co-founded a milieu of progressive artists centered on the idea of creating a new Jewish culture and promoting it in the Jewish community, the Kulturliga. And now I'm trying to switch the slide and it doesn't work. Oh. It was there that his views on the role of art in the Jewish society were formed, expressed in an important text for the Jewish avant-garde in the interwar period, The Paths of Jewish Painting, which he wrote together with Boris Aronson and published in the Kiev-based Kulturliga magazine Aufgang in 1919. And here on the picture, you see the meeting of the Kulturliga activists from 1920, and you see three friends, but also important figures in this movement. In the middle, Yisakhar Ryback, who is leaning on the shoulder of Leib Kvitko, whose works he illustrated, and on his left side, we see Boris Aronson, the co-author of this important text on Jewish art. It is in the Kyiv milieu that the desire for the creation of independent Jewish art began to be consciously shaped and expressed. The main programmatic condition of the new Jewish creativity was that it had to be not only distinguished by its content derived from Jewish thought, symbols, and topoa, but primarily by its specific form and style. These characteristics had a task of elevating Jewish art into the discourse of European art on an equal rights with the art of other nations. The importance of Kyiv as a milieu were not only the precursors, both male and female, of abstract art and constructivism were active, but also a place where the thought of avant-garde Jewish art began to bud, was emphasized by Marina Dmitrieva, who included Nathan Ryback and Boris Aronzon's text on Jewish painting in an anthology of artistic texts of Ukrainian modernism between 1910 and 1930, known also under the title Zwischen Stadt und Steppe, published in 2012. Already in the introduction, the author mentions that the Ukrainian avant-garde still stands in the shadow, and this is the quotation from Dmitrieva, still stands in the shadow of the Russian one and is often perceived as such. Dmitrieva points out that in the case of Ukrainian art of that time, researchers are still faced with the dilemma of how to define it in the face of its stylistic, national, and regional diversity. Does it have distinctive features, asks Dmitrieva, for example, in opposition to Russian art, or even French art, or German art? These are exactly the same questions posed by the Kyiv Jewish modernists from the Kulturliga group, but also by contemporary scholars involved in the issue of Jewish art. For Aronzon and Ryback, the path to independent Jewish art led through abstract forms developed by studying forms of Jewish folk art, which then would be synthesized in a modern visual language. In Ryback's case, a formative influence on his aesthetic language was his participation in Szymon Anski's ethnographic exhibition, of which we heard a lot already during this conference, from which he brought back hundreds of sketches and paintings documenting the folk art of the Jewish shtetls in the Ukraine. In their text, Ryback and Aronzon found it necessary to consider and analyze in what ways the national should be expressed in the arts. According to art theorists, it was the form, not the subject matter, that were supposed to express what was specific about the people's question. I quote, "Different peoples realize forms in different ways. Since art expresses a culture that is always national, every nation shows that national in art and has its own approach to representing its own. The common task that transcends the nations, the search for an art form, unites all true artists, but the realization of this form is always national." End of the quote. Echoes of Ryback's and Aronzon's thoughts started a whole wave of programmatic text on Jewish art, continued among avant-garde artists from Łódź, from the group Young Yiddish, and Warsaw, the Chaliastrie, groups that were formed in 1990, shortly after Kulturliga. Ryback's involvement in the creation of new Jewish art, like the development of the transnational constructivism avant-garde, unfortunately did not last long. After the failure of the Kyiv expedition in 1920 and the takeover of Kyiv by the Bolsheviks, as well as the cruel pogroms perpetrated on the Jewish population of Ukraine by Shimon Petlura, in which the artist's father was killed, Ryback left to Berlin in 1921. There he initially still wished to pursue the Jewish art project. He cooperated with the milieu of Jewish artists from Warsaw, the founding members of the Die Chaliastrie group, and was co-creating the Berlin issue of the Yiddish magazine Albatros. In 1922, together with Yankel Adler, the co-founder of the Young Yiddish group, as well as with El Lishitsky and Henrik Berlevi, just to mention a few, he planned to establish a separate Jewish art section at the first international art exhibition in Düsseldorf, which took place in 1922, which unfortunately was not realized. However, the controversial exhibition was used by Henrik Berlevi, who had previously shared Ryback's views and was heavily involved in the project of creating new Jewish art, to publicize the decline, even the death throes of expressionistic art. Berlevi announced the agony of modern art. The same agony was also attributed to the efforts of Eastern European Jewish artists to create a unique form of Jewish art, especially after many of them emigrated to the West, mostly to Berlin and Paris. As Seth Wolitz, in his extended research on the Yiddish modernist movement, rightly pointed out, this project did not gain support among German Jewish artists, who were not interested in pursuing the Jewish art projects to the same extent as Eastern European artists did. Although they welcomed their fellow Easterners with open arms because they were bringing into their milieu an air of authenticity, they still called them Ostjuden, this time in a romanticized and positive sense, by virtue of the fact that they had, quotation, maintained an uninterrupted contact with Jewish tradition and culture. This perception included Ryback, who tirelessly remained active in the field of co-creating Jewish culture in Germany. In 1924, his announcement to all Jewish artists was published in the magazine Menorah. In the short text can be read the same desire he had in his Kyiv times, to unite individual Jewish artists into a community, whether through joint exhibitions or a magazine. Hence, Ryback announces a new private initiative supported by the publishing house Gesher of Berlin to organize an exhibition entitled Das Jüdische Buch und Bild und Buch, Jewish Image and Book, which would take place in 1924, first in Berlin and then in Frankfurt am Main, Leipzig, Vienna, Prague, Amsterdam, Paris, London, and America. As an encouragement, Ryback mentions the confirmed participation of, and this is the quotation, of Jewish comrades from Germany, Austria, Poland, and America. He even invited the doyen of German Jewish artist, German Jewish avant-gardist, Ludwig Meidner, to participate in the exhibition, ending his letter disarmingly. Sie verstehen mein gebrochenes Deutsch und verzeihen mir. You understand my broken German and forgive me. I have found no mention of the exhibition in later issues of Menorah or in other Jewish periodicals, which makes it possible to argue that it did not take place. However, in the July issue of the magazine, a reproduction of a painting with Shklov's synagogue appeared on the cover, and prints from the Shtetl series were published in the same issue. The same year, a solo exhibition by Ryback was held at the Berlin Jewish Lodge in January. The review from the show was written by none other than Arnold Zweig. He described Ryback as an artist whose work attests to the existence of Jewish temperament in art. I quote, "They are finally Jewish painters, so naturally Jewish. They grew up in a completely unbroken milieu. They give us a marvelous promise for later great creations when our environment will be completely unified." The series of prints with which Ryback was most in tune with the trend in German Jewish circles at the time, still under the ideological influence of writings by Martin Buber and his idea of the Jewish Renaissance, was a series of 30 prints, Shtetl, My Destroyed Home, A Memory, published in 1923 by the Berlin publishing house Schwellen. Although much gentler in form and iconography than created a few years earlier series from the pogrom, these black and white prints do not reflect a sentimental idyll of memories. The illusory figurativeness of the protagonist depicted against a cubist background on closer inspection reveals distortions, disproportions, and deformations that introduce an atmosphere of unease and reveal hidden content related to violence. Even seemingly neutral genre scenes, such as depictions of shtetl Jews at their daily activities, indicate through their form and attributes a hidden subtext related to the dangers Jews had to face while living in the zone of settlement and in the diaspora. The scenes from the Shtetl album were among the most frequently reproduced works by Ryback in the German Jewish press. One critic used them to support the theory already circulating at that time that the best visual language which reflects the striving of the new generation for the new Jewish art was expressionism. The author of the review, citing the then extremely popular paradigm of the Jewish soul, lends credence to this theory by invoking Martin Buber's opinion that Jews are more predisposed to the motoric than the sensory features. It echoes the idea expressed by Ryback and Aronson in the programmatic text, where they juxtapose Impressionism and Expressionism, implying that the latter is more suitable for Jewish artists as it reflects a dynamic and intrinsically spiritual nature of Jews. Ryback, whose style was in fact uneven and eclectic, was thus described as predisposed to be the chief illustrator of the works of the Jewish classics Mendel and Moicher's Sforim, Yitzchok Leibush Peretz, or Sholem Aleichem, which at that time were massively translated from Yiddish into German. The appearance of Ryback's prints in the German Jewish press perpetuated and popularized the iconography associated with Eastern European Jews. They were considered all the more authentic because they were executed by an artist from Eastern Europe descent. Ryback, similarly to El Lichitsky, Isaiah Kulwiański, Rachel Shalit-Markus, just to mention a few, was considered to be an artist Ostjude. This label was becoming, in contrast to the still recent negative connotation, a pass to, among others, the art salon of Mini and Jakob Steinhardt, a founder of the group Die Pathetica, which he established together with Ludwig Meidner. Steinhardt, himself a native of Greater Poland, but with strong German background, a pupil of Hermann Strack, was fascinated by Eastern European motifs and himself aspired to be recognized as an artist who could capture the spiritual essence of this vanishing culture in his art. It is therefore not surprising that in the guest book of Jakob and Mini from 1924, there were many artists from Eastern Europe left their artistic entries. Yisakhar by Ryback included a drawing very similar to one of the scenes in the album Shtetl and added a dedication in German to Dear Steinhardt with Ryback's greetings. The Jewish German art historian, in a note on Jewish artists from Russia, claimed that in Germany, Ryback experienced an inner peace that allowed him to make another trip to his Heimat Ukraine, and this is the quotation, to look at his people from a new point of view. The result was a portfolio of Jewish types from Ukraine, published in 1924, shortly before Ryback went to Moscow and then in 1926 to Paris. The title of the work enabled the German art historian to be more specific about the land where Ryback was born and raised and started his artistic career. A fact that to many of those who tried to define Ryback's origins was not so obvious. Hence, it was easier to call him Eastern European Jewish painter or simply Ostjude. Indeed, having read many texts and biographical notes on Ryback, both the ones that were written during his lifetimes and those very contemporary, I was often puzzled by hybrid national origins that were attributed to him. Very often he is described as a Russian artist. In some biographies, his Ukrainian origins is mentioned, but some state he is even a French artist. In many cases, authors of Ryback's biographical notes use a binary or even triple adjective, such as Jewish, Ukrainian, French, like the English and German Wikipedia. His newest biography from 2019, however, authored by Sigolit Meidler-Wachs, describes him as Russian Jewish. Of course, the key to such a characterization are the power relations in a given area during a given period, which allowed the authors of these biographies to stay out of the cultural and ethnic nuances. Without being judgmental, this is the paradox that characterizes the biographical notes of many Jewish artists whose national affiliation during the numerous political transformations of the early 20th century was difficult to define succinctly. In face of the Russian aggression in the Ukraine, one tries to be more accurate and sensitive as to the proper terminology, such as the author of an article published in an online version of Forward magazine from 22nd of March, 2022, Yoel Matveyev, who deliberately evoked Ryback's art in the context of, and this is the quotation from Matveyev, Russia's bloodletting in Ukraine, in order to, another quotation, to share the stories of the contribution that Ukrainian Jews have made to our rich Jewish culture and to the world at large. Just one sentence of conclusion. As we see, the entanglement persists, and this way of mapping Jewish artists is frequent procedure that highlights the diasporic nature of their biography and art. Their subsequent confusion into categories that feature neither to their work nor, as in the case of Ryback, the project of Jewish art. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Małgorzata. We have very limited time for questions, not more than 5 minutes. Please, who have questions? Colleagues, please. Mirjam?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Božka. It was, of course, very inspiring to see again and hear about Ryback. Just one question. The Shtetl series that he published in Berlin was based on previous work. I was wondering why you didn't show it. The ones that he did in Russia before he left, I think even in Moscow, before he left for Berlin.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This series started already in 1916 when he was already in Russia. And the reason why I didn't show this evolution, so to speak, why I didn't show these origins, is that I was mostly interested in the perception of his work and why he particularly chose to publish this series in the Germany. So I was considering whether I should include it or not, but because of the time, I decided to.
Yeah, he's not the only one who did this albums in Berlin. You know, it's usually the explanation very down to earth is that in Russia there was no possibilities from financial side. Maybe even technique was not allowing, so that's why they did in Berlin. I'm not sure if it was so necessarily out of ideological reasons.
Well, I'm not. At that time, the 1920, when they left Russia, I think it wasn't possible. But if we think about this whole rich tradition of the Jewish printing book in the Ukraine, Jewish avant-garde printing books and printed magazines, I don't think it was so difficult before to do it. By Kulturliga, but also by other organizations and other artists. I mean, there's this whole rich environment based mainly on the printed illustrations and printed magazines and printed posters and printed books and Yiddish books, illustrated Yiddish books in Eastern Europe, not only in Kyiv, but also in Warsaw. The Kulturliga moved to Warsaw. So I don't think it was only, so to speak, practically, economically, it can be explained in that way. I think, and this comes also from my more extended research on how those Jewish artists from Eastern Europe were received and how they were perceived in Germany. I think it was the reason why they choose particular albums and the particular iconography for this German Jewish audience. I think there was this demand, and then there was this desire for this authentic Jewish culture, and the origins give them more value. And this guest book by Mini and Jakob Steinhardt, they are a great example for this. I mean, you can rarely see, because this was the diary, this was the guest book, but one would draw in it. I mean, I think the artists that visited their house, they were asked to leave the entries in an artistic way, not like only inscribing in it. And it's astonishing. There are like 3 volumes of this guest book, and mostly, and you have Erliszycki, Henok Barczyński, Kulwiański, like I think all the Jewish immigrants, Eastern Jewish immigrants, they went through this house and they left their entries. They all present the Eastern, maybe not all, 90% present the Eastern European motifs, the shtetl motifs. And I think there was this demand for it. And I think there is no reason, it's not without the reason that Steinhardt was the pupil of Hermann Struck. And he also, in his diaries, he wrote that he's...
And Corinth Lovins. He was much more expressionist before the war. No, that's another story. But to complicate things more, in 1922-23, Chagall was there as well. And he did the etchings for, also with Hermann Struck, for his biography, For My Life. Before it was published as a text, it was already album created that Kassirer published in Berlin. So, and he did the same thing. All the etchings for My Life are based on shtetl, on his life in Eastern Europe. So, and he's not, he was always standing aside, but he did the same thing.
Yeah, and he was also part of the Albatros initiative. But he also always described himself, I'm Russian, Jewish, and French. No, I think, and this is
later. That was he didn't. He was Russian Jew. At that time he was identified as a Russian Jew. But I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to say about this album. But and also with Steinhardt is more complicated, because Steinhardt was not suddenly discovering shtetl and going back to it. This is just an episode in his life during the World War I, and after he came back, and he worked with the images of sunset and expressionist images. He didn't continue suddenly, just be enchanted by Eastern Europe and shtetl. So I think it's a little bit more complicated. But anyhow, for Ryback it's great, because it's really not still, I think it's not seriously. Not a serious work was still done on Ryback, put it this way. So but
there was a lot of
still missing.
Yeah.
Okay. Colleagues, we don't have any time more, so I want to thank our presenters, participants of this panel, and thank you.
So we have some break now, and we'll restart in not in half an hour, unfortunately. In 25 minutes. In 25 minutes, we'll restart at 4:40.